Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another edition of The Nation Wants to Know, where we look at the issues which are of tremendous significance. We get the key newsmakers relevant from a national as well as often a global perspective. The biggest global story right now is the Iran-Israel conflict, which has even more potential, in my view, of quickly escalating into a global conflict than Ukraine or even the ongoing Israeli counter-response in the Gaza Strip. Now, yes, you all know, viewers, this started with the Israelis hitting a consulate building in Damascus, Syria on the 1st of April, killing 13 people. And then Iran hit back with firing a series of missiles and drones at Israel, which caused very limited damage because of Israel's very expensive Iron Dome interception capability. But the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has faced and continues to face very big pressure politically to escalate. And so he hit back at the ancient Iranian city of Isfahan yesterday. As we are informed, there is massive back-channel diplomacy going on all sides, and there are two clear views. One side, the dominant view, is very worried about the cost of escalation between Iran and Israel and feels that this will not be limited to the two countries. So they are very concerned about the cost of escalation, whether on the situation in the Middle East or the cost of oil and global instability, and this side is calling for calming things down as soon as possible. And then there is another side which feels it is time to use this opportunity to open a full-on attack on Iran. And that side is led by several players in government as well as people outside of government, like my guest tonight, His Royal Highness the Crown Prince of Iran, Reza Pahlavi. He joins me tonight from Washington. Your Royal Highness, welcome to The Nation Wants to Know. It's good to have you on the program. And if I can refer to you henceforth as Mr. Pahlavi, Mr. Pahlavi has been calling for regime change in Iran. And he feels that this is the time to push the envelope. And so that takes me to my first question to you, Mr. Pahlavi. Why would you want the world, led by the United States, Israel and others, to push the envelope when you are aware that that could lead to further global instability, which is the last thing that the world needs right now?
Let me begin by explaining the fact that I have been critical overall of a basic flaw in the foreign policy of Western governments in their dealing with the current regime occupying my homeland. From the very beginning, there was an expectation of behavior change, and all the policies implemented, including sanctions, were with the aim to force the regime back to negotiation and understanding. The very premise of expecting behavior change from a system that in its entirety, in its DNA, in its entire reason for existence, was to export a religious ideology in the region and beyond, it cannot coexist in the world where democracies, where human rights and liberties are respected, for them to be able to coexist with their ideology at the same time. Therefore, all these years we've seen attempts to try and reach some compromise, thinking that the regime could reform itself. And in the meantime, the Iranian people have been suffering and suffering with no change in sight. My argument about why a change of regime in Iran will be in the best interest of the Iranian people, who are the first people to ask for it, by the way. It's not a matter of a foreign government deciding our fate. It's the Iranian people who want that. But they demand the world to support them, because this regime, as long as it exists, it will continue to create the kind of problems we've seen all these decades, which means not only repression at home against its own citizens, but aggression abroad, using its proxies like Hamas, like Hezbollah, like Islamic Jihad, like the Houthis, to disrupt world commerce, to meddle into the affairs of neighboring countries, and most importantly, in the recent clash that we have seen. This regime does not desire what's best for the Iranian people. It is simply trying to ascertain itself. And if the world wants to put away once and for all the problems that were caused by this regime, there's only one solution left. If we don't want escalation, if we do not want military confrontation, but a change that comes from within at the hand of the Iranian people themselves. This is where the world can make a key decision of finally helping the Iranian people this time, as opposed to insisting on negotiating with a regime that will never be willing to come to terms with the values that
Mr. Pahlavi,
the free world stands for.
I understand. I understand, but I'm sure that I'm sure you wouldn't disagree with me that the Iranians would have done their own geostrategic analysis of the situation. You mentioned the fact that Iran has been working through, its proxies, the three H's, Hezbollah, Houthis, and Hamas. But isn't it possible that Iran itself is a proxy for other global powers? Because Iran on its own would not have dared to carry out the kind of attack it did as a counter response on Israel without having planned the grand strategy of what would follow. So perhaps they are also working for someone else's interests beyond their own.
By the way, Arnab, I would very much appreciate if people like yourselves as a member of the media and other colleagues of yours refer to the situation not as Iran, meaning the people of Iran, and instead say the regime. The Iranian people are very sensitive about the fact that they keep mentioning Iran, and we as Iranians do not stand 1 second with what this regime is doing. So let's call it the Islamic regime and what it's doing, or the Islamic Republic. It is true, they have been pretty much held in power by means of their dependence on some foreign powers. Example, Russia. For a long time, the Russians have been helping the regime with its military and intelligence forces. The current Moscow-Tehran axis, as Tehran is helping Putin fight his war against Ukraine, is an example. As such, clearly, the regime has also some partners that have a different viewpoint as far as the geopolitics of the region is concerned. However, I think the majority of the countries around the globe realize that in the long term, nobody will benefit from such instability. It's not good for security. It's not good for commerce. And the root cause, again, is the regime disrupting all of this. So regardless of whether or not this regime may have some allies, but it has far many more adversaries insofar as the free world is concerned. This is where the Iranian people stand together with the free world against a regime that is repressing them and is not offering them a chance to self-determination. I believe that once Iran is freed, you will see a completely different picture and demeanor as it relates to regional peace and cooperation and our relationship worldwide with anybody that's willing to respect our independence and sovereignty.
You've been talking about a regime change. What do you have in mind? I mean, are you talking about a full-fledged invasion of Iran? Would that be right? If America is very concerned about sovereignty of other nations?
I don't know why you are.
So what do you mean by regime change? Then how do you see that coming into effect?
Well, it's a domestic liberation movement at the hand of the Iranian people. It's a little bit like putting more pressure on the regime by helping the Iranian people directly. Look, what happened in Poland with Lech Walesa and Solidarity? What happened in South Africa to put an end to apartheid? None of this was as a result of foreign invasion. It was a matter of support directly to the dissidents, to the activists, to the civil society of those countries, giving them an equal footing to be able to have a chance to bring pressure from within. The mechanism of change of regime in Iran is not going to be at the hand of any foreign intervention. In fact, it is my red line. I have always been extremely opposed to any kind of military confrontation or intervention against my country. But I believe that through civil disobedience, through mass protests and labor strikes, we can paralyze the regime and force it to collapse. And following that will be an interim phase by which we should have a constitutional process whereby the Iranian people can elect their representative to a constitutional assembly to debate Iran's future, the constitution, the formal regime, the content, and everything else that is at play. In other words, to have true self-determination. Right now, India is experiencing, as the largest democracy in the world, a process of election. And how much we value the fact that without such freedoms and the ability to choose, citizens are completely voiceless. That is the current situation in Iran. That needs to change. 85 million Iranians have to have an opportunity to speak for themselves. And this is why free countries, particularly democracies, need to support them in this struggle against a regime that has completely taken those freedoms away from Iranians.
But you know, you're talking about basically uprising on the ground, on the streets of Iran, and people had expected that in the fallout of the Mahsa Amini case. There were protests on the ground which started almost immediately. I think it was the autumn of 2022. You had yourself called for protests and mobilization at that point of time. But it didn't really take off beyond a point. So why would you think the situation is different now? When it would be seen to be the world against the... Yes, yeah. Why would the situation be different now?
Well, first of all, you have to understand that for some ingredients being missing, you cannot get to the final result that one wants to obtain. The Iranian people have done their part. They've done all they could under tremendous duress and repression at home. The very same time Iran is waging war against Israel, the regime is cracking down on Iranian women on the streets of Iran. It's maintaining its instrument of repression. But the brave Iranian people, today's Gen Z of Iran, the young generation, stand against them. They still are continuing the fight. What is absent is two things. There still is not a clear and strong leadership from key Western countries to support this movement. And number two, obviously, there has to be the kind of leadership that makes this happen. While the Mahsa Amini Women Life Freedom Movement was certainly a revolutionary state of protest, but the mechanisms of change have to also be in place. This doesn't happen automatically. We need to be able to work with elements within the country. They need to be able to connect with the outside world. They need to have their representation on the international scene so that the world understand exactly how and through what means they can be of help and support this movement. Then we can have a legitimate chance to succeed. But if you have, while you have such a revolution on the streets of Iran, certain governments who are bent on appeasement, who release billions of dollars of money into the hand of a regime that is not going to spend it on the starving Iranian people, but instead spending on its proxies all across the world, how do you expect change to actually happen? The will for change has to come finally in the mind of the outside world. Now, having said that, I've always said to my fellow compatriots, we cannot depend on anybody else but ourselves. However, it will be far simpler and less costly to us if we had the tacit support of the free world. This is what we need right now. That is the missing element. With that in play, a lot will change.
But you know, now let's go into, let me draw you into the real politics of it. We clearly understand where you're coming from on this matter, but you know, peace is important. The world at this point of time is not crying for more conflict. Less conflict is required, de-escalation is required. The world has been through COVID, then Ukraine, and then, as you're aware, the situation on the Gaza Strip. And all those calling for peace would say, Mr. Pahlavi, that just let's keep the peace with Iran. Because the geographical position of Iran is extremely important. We need to keep the peace and the status quo on the Straits of Hormuz. We need to make sure that the Iranians and the Houthis are kept under control, that business is on as usual. Let's settle things down. Let's settle Ukraine. Let's settle Gaza before we open up another front, however much we may disagree with the Iranian regime. And therefore, I'm sure you're aware that, you know, there needs to be peace on the Persian Gulf. Iranians have been seizing ships. Recently, they seized British ships as well. You know what the Houthis have been doing. And Iran will leverage its geographical location to some extent when it negotiates with the rest of the world. These are all the factors that come in when things like the US-Iranian nuclear agreement, which had been signed, which is defunct now, came into effect. I mean, there's a sort of practical spirit. Yes, we don't agree, but we are no longer in the George W. Bush world of the axis of evil. We've got to learn to work even with our enemies. What would you say to them, Mr. Pahlavi?
Well, I believe that freedom is tantamount, and whenever a citizen's freedom is taken away from them, they have every right to ask for change. And if the world is copping out behind the excuse of maintaining the status quo simply because they don't have a vision for something that could be better, simply because they don't realize that it is as a result of this regime that we have instability, you expect the very same regime that has caused all this mayhem to be an element you can depend on to calm down, to bring peace all of a sudden. From the day the regime set foot in Iran, it had as an agenda to export its ideology. It became adversely confrontational vis-à-vis the Arab countries in the Persian Gulf. It started antagonizing its regional neighbors. It started exporting this ideology in the four corners of the world. And as a result, we have what we have now. I find it very surprising that after 45 years and the proof of the behavior of this regime, and as I said earlier, the expectation is maybe today they will be reasonable and finally come to terms. That expectation is wrong. You have just wasted time to a point that now we are facing more challenges. Now, the only way, again, I repeat, the only way we can, for good, eliminate every element that is leading to this instability, which is tied directly to the nature of this regime, is to get rid of it. Again, at the hand and at the ask of the Iranian people, because the Iranian people are not going to put up with this any longer. They are ready to change. So the choice is very simple. You can either ignore the Iranian people's right to self-determination and freedom, a nation that wants to be at peace in the world, that does not have any reason to be antagonistic versus the Israelis or the Arabs or anybody else in our neighborhood, but are hostage. They're the first hostage of a regime that is doing precisely all of these negative deeds. Now, what is the price to pay? Is the price to achieve ultimately a liberation more expensive than dealing with this regime every day in terms of, as you said it yourself, escalation, disruption of commerce and maritime traffic? Is that cost less than the cost of change for Iran and the consequences of that? I challenge, therefore, those who claim that, no, we have to be using realpolitik as an argument. I think that's basically the language of weak leadership. Look, the world changed twice, at least in contemporary history, where we've seen that as a result of that strong leadership, things did change for the better. Example, Second World War. Example, Roosevelt and Churchill vis-a-vis Hitler during the Second World War. Later on, towards the end of the Soviet Union, you had Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, two strong leaders that brought an end to the Soviet Empire. The same kind of leadership is required today. In the absence of leadership, I can hear this argument float more and more, but it does not excuse the fact that we should address the real question and take the bull by the horn. We have to do our part as Iranians, but the world needs to stand with us. That's the choice they have to make. They either side with the people of Iran or they continue siding with this regime.
Are you saying that Are you saying that Biden is a weak leader who is appeasing Khamenei? That he does not want a bigger war to break out because there's a US election coming up and he doesn't want to be seen diverting assets from Ukraine, leading to a bigger mess. I mean, you may be more open with me on this. Are you saying that Biden is appeasing Khamenei, that he's a weak leader? The Americans are showing weak leadership?
Yes, I believe so. I mean, the result is right in front of us. The regime had access to almost $100 billion worth of oil revenue that it should not have had should the oil sanction had been implemented correctly. That extra cash, that extra money was something that, again, not only made it easier for the regime to spend it on its proxies, including the recent conflicts and all the drones and missiles had to be paid for from somewhere. That's the extra cash that the regime should not have had in the first place, but it did. But it's also something that emboldens such regimes. Look, let me give you another statistics away from war and conflict and missiles. If you take the period of time where there was stronger leadership in this country during the Trump administration, between the Obama administration and the Biden administration, the number of executions in Iran was half the amount it is today. Why? Because that kind of leadership and strength basically makes such regimes think twice before they do anything, whether it's at home or abroad. I do say that vis-a-vis the fact that we are dealing with two powerful countries that have a lot of influence and say to what is happening in the region, Russia and China, what is the counterpart doing? I think many of our friends in the region are growing frustrated for their lack of resolve and indecisiveness and appeasement. And that frustration could create some reconsideration of their policies and alignment. But I don't think we need to get that far. I think there's still an opportunity to resolve the issue. But I can tell you the main problem remains the regime. And the world has to understand that fighting the tentacles is no longer a solution. You have to go for the eye of the octopus. And the eye of the octopus is Tehran that controls all of these tentacles all over the place. Again, let me repeat so I'm very clear and I'm not misunderstood or misinterpreted. I'm not calling for any foreign military attack or intervention. I'm telling you that the natural army in place are the people of Iran. The people of Iran deserve to have the support of the outside world in order to liberate themselves. That is the best investment you can make for peace, security, and long-term economic stability at the hand of a liberated people who are on your side, as opposed to a regime that simply wants to impose a modern-day religious caliphate and dominate the region and the world. That's the two choices we have.
Mr. Pahlavi, let me take you on your terminology there, where you say the eye of the octopus is Tehran. Now, the regime in Tehran, are you sure about that? It would also be contended that the eye of the octopus could be Russia. It could be argued that the eye of the octopus could be China, in a way. It could be argued that Russia is trying to open a new front. And it would further be argued that it is against American interests or the interests of the West to play into Russia's hands by opening a new front, especially at this time of political sensitivity in the US as well. What would you say to that? That it is not in the long-term interests of America to get drawn or to let this escalate. It is in Russia's interest to let this escalate and watch as America opens more and more fronts to its, to its own detriment.
I don't know why it is that you insist so much on using militaristic terms and fronts and deployments as if we were talking about military confrontation and escalation. That's not what I'm proposing. What I'm talking about is the liberation of a nation that is under siege by a regime that has kept them hostage. It's a process of liberation. It's not escalation or opening fronts that we're talking about. I think the world today is savvy enough, whether you're French, American, Canadian, or Japanese, to understand the value of the independence and freedom. I mean, India went through an independence movement to liberate itself. If that is not as valuable that they're willing to put everything on the line for it, then why should Iranians deserve any less than Indians, or for that matter, Americans, or people in Sweden or in Australia? Liberty and freedom is tantamount to bringing us more guarantee of stability, because democracies don't go at war to one another. The fact that this regime is in conflict, because it's not a democracy, it's a religious dictatorship. And ultimately, that is the problem. Now, would China benefit from it? Would Russia benefit from it? Perhaps. But the root cause of the problem is not Moscow or Beijing. It is the regime that has occupied my country, and it is based in Iran. That's why I point to Tehran as the problem. And that's why the solution is going to be within Iran itself. I'm not asking for Moscow or Beijing or Washington to determine the fate of the Iranian people, but to ask themselves the question, what is ultimately the vision that a free Iran will have vis-a-vis the whole world? It's not going to be aligned only with the West. It's not going to be aligned only with the East. It's going to be working with whoever respects our sovereignty and freedom, and will work with them, with any of these countries who would like to have a better relationship with Iran. This regime is not providing that opportunity, but a free Iran will.
I understand your the reason why you disagree with my use of what you are calling militaristic terms, which I may only describe as the practical situation on the ground right now, because you are in Washington. You had urged the US and the Israel earlier not to fall into what you called a trap by escalating their disputes with the Iranian government into a military conflict, and that was in 2017. But as of today, you would agree with me, sir, that that is exactly what appears to be playing out. And therefore, I think there is a distinct possibility that Iran, if it realizes that the conflict has broken out. Now, let me give you a slightly elaboration of why I'm saying this to you. I'll take just a minute. Your Royal Highness, Iran would know, have a good sense of whether the West can escalate this right now. And if the West comes to a conclusion that it does not want to escalate it right now, then the Iranians have the upper hand in any negotiation. Should such a negotiation happen through back channels or otherwise, either through open dialogue or through secret contact or clandestine diplomacy, which you know does happen, in that case, could it be possible that the end game for the regime in Tehran is to renegotiate and reopen the nuclear deal, which is presently in tatters? Because they need that nuclear deal, they need the sanctions lifted, they need the economy to pick up, and they can feel that in turn for agreeing to de-escalate, they might want to take the benefit of resuming a more working relationship with the rest of the world and using every leverage that they have, including their maritime interests in the Straits of Hormuz, as a negotiating chip. Your response to that?
My job is not to defend the regime's interest. My job is to defend the Iranian people's interest. And what is in conflict with the Iranian people's interest is the survival and continuing existence of a regime that has deprived us of our freedom and our liberties. Therefore, I will challenge and I will stand vis-a-vis any entity, government, foreigners who would think that the status quo should prevail and the Iranian people don't deserve any better and they should be sacrificed in the interest of realpolitik, or as you say, avoiding any kind of escalation. I would not stand for a second and accept that premise that it's okay to let the Iranian people continue to be victims of this regime while the regime is trying to play some kind of strategic compromise with the world. Understand that most of its behavior has been not as a position of strength, but actually weakness. A regime that is strong does not repress its citizenry. A regime that is strong doesn't, after 45 years worth of passage of time, still continue to be aggressive, meddling in the affairs of neighboring states, unless you are willing to say, we have to put up with this religious dictatorship. That's what it is. The world has to accept it as a matter of fact, and therefore we should throw in the white towel and go home. Yeah, of course, that is an eventual possibility, but is it the right moral position to take? What happened to liberty? What happened to freedom? What happened to human rights? What happened to all those values that I believe the Western world has not abandoned, at least as of yet? This is also something to consider, not just an economic issue, not just the kind of elements that you pointed. A lot more is at stake. And therefore, I would still argue that the people of Iran would be able to tell the whole world and demonstrate to the whole world that unlike this regime that is constantly blackmailing you, that is taking ransom money to liberate hostages, and you pay the price for that, and is going to continue to be emboldened as a result. And therefore, it is not by appeasement that it will reduce the conflict. It will be no guarantee that the regime will not continue to do more of what it's done already, because it has proven to do that, especially when it faces weak leadership on the other side. So I point back to what is my proposition to the world. You have never, ever, until this moment, even assumed that it is plausible that this regime will no longer be around. It is plausible that it can collapse as a result of internal pressure. Then do you have a plan for that? Do you have a plan for that alternative? If you don't, you'll be in real dire difficulty. Better yet, start thinking about what that alternative could be and why it is ultimately in your best interest to do that. I'm not asking for the world to come to our rescue for our sake. I'm actually arguing that it is in their own interest to do that, because we both benefiting from the disappearance of an element that has been causing all of this turmoil and disruption and escalation. And I don't think that this regime even understands realpolitik, because when you say realpolitik, it means you are a realist and reasonable. Again, a real world that is realistic is expecting the same behavior of a regime that is not reasonable, that is not realistic, that is purely ideological. And that's why it will never come to terms or change its behavior. Herein lies the fundamental argument that I have vis-a-vis the world that says, well, if we are practical, maybe they are practical too. Are they?
No. Well, I mean, what if the price of oil go through the roof? What if the global economy tanks? What if the Straits of Hormuz are paralyzed? Why
Well,
would the
first of all,
world pay the
the
price
last time the
for
pressure was
the
exerted,
regime change,
the
however
oil
important
prices
in
did not
Iran,
go up
as you are arguing?
through the roof.
I'm not just talking about Iranian oil, I'm also talking about the imbalance in global trade, the possible blocking of certain maritime routes, and the consequences of
But
an escalated conflict
as I
involving
said, the
Iran.
more the regime stand in place, the more harm it could do. And if you think that it is through blackmail and it's through nuclear deterrence of an undemocratic regime that the world will feel safer, or for that matter, our neighborhood will feel safer, I don't know where we're leading with that. I mean, can you imagine that if this regime actually negotiates a nuclear deal, why would it want to pursue a nuclear arsenal in the first place if its intention was peaceful usage of the energy? Why did we not start continuing the policy
That's
that
because the
back before
sanctions,
the
they would say
revolution we
that's
were going
because
to
the
have
sanctions came
nuclear
back
plants of light water
and the
plants, not
Americans
heavy
turned
water
their
plants.
back on the nuclear deal as well.
I'm sorry, I
They would
was
say that
talking, I
those were,
couldn't hear your
that
question.
was,
Could you repeat,
tit
please?
for tat. No, I'm sorry, but
I'm sorry.
yeah. So I
I
was saying
didn't
that
understand your question. Could you repeat
the
it, please?
argument of the Iranian regime could be, yeah, the argument. I repeat myself. The argument of the Iranian regime could be that that was a tit for tat. The Americans went back, the sanctions came back, and they went back to their nuclear pursuits. But now, possibly, they may want to reopen that conversation.
So basically, we should be open to proliferation, and many countries in the region will also pursue a nuclear program to equal that of Iran. Where are we going with this? Are we going to talk about a whole region having access to WMDs? Is that really the future we are painting for the Middle East? All because there is a regime that is provoking and forcing everybody's hand in that direction? Or can we eliminate the problem so we wouldn't have to start considering proliferation? So the Saudis build their bomb, or the UAE build their bombs, or the Egyptians build their bombs, and pretty soon everybody has a bomb. And then what? I mean, seriously, if that's the direction the world wants to take, I cannot have a logical answer to that. But you can eliminate every aspect of the problem that threatens maritime traffic. That could be a nuclear threat. That could be an existential threat to countries like Israel, that is sponsoring terrorism, that is interfering in the affairs of governments in the region, from Syria to Iraq to Lebanon. I don't think the world is prepared to continue living along with this kind of a regime, especially when it is extremely fragile at home, that the majority of its citizenry is against it, and they stand ready to save themselves, but they need an extra assistance from the world that is, instead of helping them, are still throwing them under the bus, insisting, as you argued, on the status quo, hoping that maybe through that we can all tone down the escalation. I think this regime has proven that if it wanted to maintain stability, why would it do what it did? Why would it support a terrorist group? Why would it attack Israel and so on and so forth?
Yeah, but you know, the world is also changing in a multilateral world, Mr. Pahlavi. Why should it be the concern of the West what happens across the world? Why should the West look upon itself as the savior of every part of the world? And we all know what happened when you refer to the WMD case. You know what happened last time when WMDs were used as, as a good excuse to carry out a full-blown invasion. So now isn't the world changing? What if Chinese were to say that we want to liberate another part of the world? What if the Indians were to say we want to liberate another part of the world? Invasions of sovereignty, either which way, are not good. And so if we were to go back to the attack by the Israelis on the consulate in Damascus, that is still sovereign territory. That was a violation of another country's sovereign territory. Upon an intelligence input or upon a perception of intelligence of Israel. My question being, why should it be that the West or the forces supported by the West, including Israel, should feel that they have some kind of a moral superiority in terms of intervening to help people across other parts of the world? In the changing dynamics across the world, which is multilateral, perhaps that would not be the right way to look at it anymore.
Well, first of all, you mentioned the word sovereignty several times. Well, the Iranian people currently are not enjoying sovereignty because their vote doesn't count. They're being repressed, muzzles. We have political prisoners. We have executions. If we are looking to the outside world, the Iranians are looking to the West, not to Moscow or to Beijing, because at least in the West, there seems to be a principle of liberty and freedom and democracy. I would not compare India to China. India is a democracy. So if you think that as a democratic country, it is in your best interest to promote democracies, especially for a nation that wants to have it, and you would call that intervention, I don't call it intervention. I call it a moral duty. People who are free should help other peoples be free. That's the premise. Now, is it a multilateral world? Yes, it is. But I choose to work with free countries. I choose to work with Western democracies. I choose to work with everybody who values the principles of freedom and liberty and would be defending human rights as a matter of moral obligation. It's as simple as that. Now, if there are other countries that do not have the same principles in view and are in fact interfering in Iran by not letting the Iranian people achieve freedom, that is some kind of interference in itself. You are not allowing for a nation, or you are in a way interfering with their ability to free themselves. And freedom is, I think, the paramount issue here. Otherwise, if it's just a matter of maintaining dictatorships in place and justifying it, something that happened the last century a lot of times, the world has changed. But I think today social media points to us that many nations around the world, regardless of their ethnic background or religious aspects or composition, freedom is the universal language. Freedom is a universal ask. And which is why we have seen that in all these recent demonstrations of solidarity, people around the world stood with the Iranian people as they were calling for their freedom. Now, that's the ask of the people in the world. What governments do, let's ask them. Let's put them on the spot and say, why don't you, in fact, support these movements? But I think the question of freedom is not going to be, for me, an element subject to negotiation. Freedom is paramount and tantamount. That's what I'm here for. That's what I'm fighting for, regardless of the challenges we face.
But why would you want sanctions which would affect the lives of your own people? You're calling for further sanctions on the regime in Iran, and you're going on and saying that, of course, you know, this is not your exact words here, that this is not the war of the Iranian people, it is Ali Khamenei's war. But my question to you is, why would you want sanctions which would make it more and more difficult for your own people, for people in hospitals in Iran, for children to get the food and the medicines they need in Iran, and for the old and elderly people needing treatment to be denied the access to medicines and treatment that they would need? Would you say that even their suffering would be justified towards the larger purpose which you're pushing for?
Basically, you're parroting the argument of the apologists for the regime and those who always have said that sanctions doesn't work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Look, the regime is not spending money on the Iranian people. Do you think that the $100 billion they received was spent on any school or hospitals or helping the people who are starving on the streets of Iran? They did get that money recently, didn't they? Was it spent? Was a cent of it spent on Iranian, despite the fact that we have sanctions? It wasn't. This is simply money in the hand of the regime. And the reason why sanctions are important, it's not because it affects the people of Iran. It's because it's going to restrain the regime to have more means to support its war machine of repression at home and conflict abroad. Now, of course, sanctions in and of itself is not sufficient. You need to have, parallel to this, a policy of support. These two ingredients combined could put an end to this regime as a result of change from within. But that hasn't done. So if there's a continuation of economic malaise in Iran, it's not because of the sanctions, it's because of the regime has not been truly challenged so that we can get rid of it. Once we are rid of it, immediately the economic situation in Iran could improve. Everybody knows that. Iranians are understanding of that. How many Iranians, despite the fact that are in fuel lines, despite the fact that they are starving, are objecting to any kind of pressure on the regime? Only the regime and its elements say that, not the Iranian people. It all depends who you're listening to. Are you listening to the regime propagandists, or are you listening to the Iranian people? If you listen to the Iranian people, you will see that the majority of them understand the reason why this regime needs to be sanctioned. Because it is under appeasement that the
Now,
regime silently executes more people, brutalizes more women, keeps more people in jail and dissidents. They have to face that kind of pressure from the outside world, but they also need to receive the support in order to do whatever they need to do from within. These are the two combination elements. So yes, it is important to maintain pressure on this regime. Because you have to limit its ability. It's not going to trickle down to the people. Even if the sanctions were removed, this regime will not be spending it on the Iranian people.
Got it. But obviously you can disagree with my question, but you have absolutely no right to make some kind of assumption that, you can disagree with the question, but you have no right to make the assumption that I am repeating the propaganda of others, because I'm not making a similar charge about you on the program. I equally can say that you're also being a propagandist for certain interests in the West, but I'm not saying that. So I think we should reserve our views of who feels who's speaking for whom to ourselves, because if we want to discuss the Middle East, and I can push the envelope on that, it is the United States which is the elephant in the room. America's Iran policy does not have a bipartisan consensus. We have typically seen Democrats indulging more with the present regime in Iran vis-a-vis the Republicans. And some analysts say it's unlikely that the Israeli response may have been less restrained but for a Democrat, Joe Biden, as a president. You've been yourself critical of Biden. So essentially we can't cover up the fact that there's a lack of bipartisan consensus within the United States. In any case, my follow-up question to you is, and that's only my response to your unfair charge. My question to you is, why should the people of Iran believe that you have their best interests in mind? Because you lived in the United States for a large part of your life. You moved there well in your 20s. You've lived outside Iran, and you're very vocal about the situation in Iran. Some people would see you as a Western prop. How would you respond to that? That you're taking a certain political line which would go well with the West, but not be in the interests of the Iranian people. This charge is something I want you to respond to as directly as possible.
That's very easy to prove. All you have to do is to monitor Iranian social media. All you have to do is to look at various polls that have been done about what level of support or popularity I have in Iran. These are not polls conducted by me. It's in fact conducted by elements who are not necessarily my sympathizers. And you will see right there and then the amount of respect and trust that they have in what I've been doing and the legacy of my family. All you have to do is to monitor what's happening in Iranian social media and the feedback and reactions that my compatriots are demonstrating. Now, as far as my own contact with my fellow compatriots, which is on a daily basis, the fact that I was physically unable to be in Iran, the fact that I was physically away from my country, doesn't mean for a second that I'm not aware of everything that is happening in my country every single day, in all of the smallest details. Why is this vision important? And that's the reason why Iranians have faith in my ability to help them, is because this is one of the very few people, if not the only person they can trust. And they say so. And that trust has tremendous amount of value for me. It's a political capital that I'm spending on the liberation of my fellow compatriots. They need to have a chance to determine their own future. Currently, they don't. And what I stand for is a process that not only frees our country from the stronghold of a religious dictatorship, but would also provide them with an opportunity to decide their own fate in the parliamentary process. This is exactly the kind of plan that I'm proposing. It has nothing to do with America or Europe or any other country. It's a process that we as Iranians deserve to have to determine our own fate. So on that basis, my ask and my message to anybody who's willing to listen to this message is to understand why Iranians deserve to have that opportunity, something they've been deprived on ever since this regime has taken over. That's what I stand for. This is my agenda, and let the chips fall where they may.
And lastly, what are your plans? We're very intrigued. Of late, you've been speaking to a lot of leading media networks globally. You're increasing your footprint. You're speaking in very influential circles in the topmost universities in the world. What are your plans? What is your end game in this?
The plan is to make sure that we are in this first phase successful in bringing this regime to collapse by means of internal pressure, probably at its climax, nationwide labor strikes, which is the least costly way and the most effective way to paralyze the regime. And of course, to be prepared to manage a transition phase, at which time an interim government will have to be formed. I think the majority of the participants are, as I speak, inside the country. We have to be able to plan for the inclusivity of the majority of elements that are not criminally tied to this regime, whether on the civilian side, but particularly on the military and paramilitary side. There has to be an exit strategy offered to them so they can see a place for themselves beyond this regime. We're not talking about the disaster of the Baathification in Iraq after the fall of Saddam Hussein and send all the troops home, and half of them ended up becoming ISIS fighters. This is also part of the plan to be inclusive of the majority of them who are not corrupt or involved in the criminal behavior of this ruling mafia. That is also tantamount to calling the nation to national reconciliation and amnesty to the extent possible. We have to make sure that during the transition, we have every element of transitional justice taken into consideration. We have to prepare the grounds as soon as possible for the election of a constitutional assembly, whereby all these elements of the constitution, the form of the regime, its content, the level of centralization or decentralization of power, and so on, will be debated. And ultimately, when this parliament will propose to the nation a constitutional plan, the nation can, in a referendum, adopt and finally vote for what they want for their future. To me, that's the end game. The end game for me is the day Iranians go to the poll and finally determine the future of the land. I would have considered that a lifetime's mission accomplished.
Well, this has been very interesting. We'll track whatever you do next. And of course, we'll keep talking to you as we watch the situation in Iran and in the Middle East. Thank you very much, Mr. Pahlavi, for talking to me and for talking to the Republic Media Network. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the opportunity.